back on the air. Because we've known each other for over 20 years. I know you as a...
Picture this. You've just been told your show is ending. Not because nobody's watching, quite the opposite. You're the #1 host in your entire time slot for the 9th year running. And then weeks later, your closest rival in the industry, a man you've spent a decade trading friendly jabs with on late night, offers you his own chair to sit in. Free of charge. No strings attached. And you say no. That's exactly what happened between Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel in the summer of 2025. And when Colbert finally explained why, it revealed something far more human than anyone expected from the middle of a corporate media firestorm. This is the full story of how it happened, why it happened, and what it says about the strange, shifting world of late-night television in 2025 and 2026. Let's rewind to the moment that started it all. On July 17, 2025, CBS dropped a bombshell. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert would end when Colbert's contract expired in May 2026. On the surface, that's just business. Networks cancel shows all the time. Except this wasn't a struggling program, limping toward its inevitable end. This was the highest-rated show in the 11:30 p.m. slot, a program that had beaten both Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show and Jimmy Kimmel's own program for 9 consecutive television seasons. Colbert didn't inherit that success easily. When he took over from David Letterman in September 2015, he was walking into an impossible situation, following a broadcasting legend, using a persona audiences barely knew, since most people associated him with the fictional blowhard pundit he played for years on Comedy Central. For the first year or so, Fallon's viral games and celebrity bits kept NBC comfortably in first place. But something shifted as America's political temperature rose during the 2016 election cycle. Colbert leaned into sharper, more topical monologues, and audiences responded. By the 2016 to 2017 season, he'd overtaken Fallon for good, a lead he never relinquished. So when the cancellation came, it genuinely stunned the industry, and even CBS's own leadership had a hard time squaring the announcement with reality. Network president George Cheeks had gone on record calling Colbert the network's top performer in the time slot. CBS's official explanation was that this was strictly a financial call, driven by a late-night advertising model that had been eroding for years as viewers moved to streaming and social platforms. That explanation wasn't crazy on its face. Late night as a genre really has been bleeding ad dollars industry-wide. But the timing made a lot of people raise an eyebrow, because just 3 days before the announcement, Colbert had used his own monologue to take a swing at the company signing his checks. Here's the backdrop. CBS's parent company, Paramount Global, had just agreed to settle a lawsuit brought by Donald Trump over how 60 Minutes edited an interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris. Paramount paid $16 million, money that was earmarked for Trump's future presidential library, rather than going to him directly, all while continuing to insist the network's editing had followed normal broadcast standards and that it had done nothing wrong. A number of media law experts publicly doubted Trump's case had much legal weight, which made the decision to settle look, to many observers, less like a legal necessity and more like a business calculation. And there was a very obvious business reason to want this fight to go away quietly. Paramount was in the middle of trying to close an approximately $8 billion merger with Skydance Media, a deal that needed sign-off from federal regulators, including the FCC, before it could close. A lawsuit from a sitting president hanging over the company during a sensitive regulatory review was, to put it mildly, not ideal. Colbert clearly saw the connection, and he wasn't shy about saying so. Opening his show, he told the audience, "As someone who has always been a proud employee of this network, I'm offended." Then he called the settlement a big fat bribe. The studio audience loved it. The reaction outside the Ed Sullivan Theater was a lot more complicated, because it's one thing to needle a politician on your own show, and it's another entirely to publicly accuse the company that owns your paycheck of paying off the President of the United States to smooth its own merger through the regulatory pipeline. 3 days later, CBS announced the show was ending. CBS has always maintained there was no connection. But the sequence of events was enough to pull in a chorus of outside voices questioning the official story. Jimmy Kimmel and Jon Stewart both spoke up in Colbert's defense. David Letterman weighed in critically on his old network's decision, and even sitting lawmakers, including Senator Elizabeth Warren, publicly pressed for more clarity on what had actually driven the call. To understand why this all mattered so much, you have to understand the size of what Paramount was trying to pull off. The Skydance merger, announced back in July 2024, was one of the biggest media deals in years. roughly $8 billion, restructuring one of the oldest names in American broadcasting and handing control to Skydance founder David Ellison, backed by Redbird Capital Partners. Because CBS holds broadcast licenses on dozens of local television stations, the deal needed the FCC's blessing, plus review from other federal regulators on antitrust grounds. That's already a high-stakes process, even without a presidential lawsuit hanging over the company's news division. Then everything piled up almost at once: the lawsuit, the settlement, Colbert's monologue, the cancellation announcement, and finally the merger's approval. Once that approval came through, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr made a comment that added real fuel to the fire. He said the new ownership had expressed interest in reorienting CBS News to correct what they viewed as bias in the organization. That's the kind of statement that makes journalists nervous, and it was quickly followed by a wave of departures inside CBS News, including News Division President Winnie McMahon and longtime 60 Minutes executive producer Bill Owens, both of whom left amid what were described as disputes over editorial independence during the ownership transition. Into that vacuum stepped Bari Weiss, the former New York Times opinion editor and founder of the Free Press, who was named editor-in-chief of CBS News under the new regime. Weiss has spent years as a lightning rod for her critiques of newsroom groupthink and her outspoken positions on issues like free expression in Israel, so her appointment alone was enough to reignite the whole debate about where CBS News was headed next. Put it all together, and you've got a genuinely wild convergence: a comedy show, a presidential lawsuit, a multi-billion-dollar merger, federal regulators, a newsroom leadership shakeup, and a national argument about press independence, all tangled together within the span of a few months. Once the cancellation went public, the response from inside the industry was immediate and unusually unified. This wasn't just fans mourning a favorite show, it was Colbert's peers on camera, standing up for him. Jimmy Kimmel, Jon Stewart, and Seth Meyers all spoke out in his defense almost right away. Kimmel, in particular, went further than a supportive quote. Rather than air a fresh episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live against Colbert's farewell broadcast, he chose to run a rerun instead and actively encourage his own audience to go watch Colbert say goodbye. In an industry built on nightly ratings competition, that's a genuinely rare move. And it didn't stop there. Not long after, Kimmel revealed something that would become the centerpiece of this whole story. He invited Colbert to be one of the rotating celebrity guest hosts filling in for him during his 2025 summer hiatus. On paper, it was the perfect landing spot, a chance for Colbert to stay visible, keep his comedic voice in the conversation, and do it all from a friendly host chair rather than starting something new from scratch. Colbert turned it down. This is the part that eventually became public, and it's less dramatic and honestly more relatable than a lot of the speculation floating around at the time. Speaking to Variety, Kimmel confirmed he'd made the offer directly to Colbert. "Of course, I asked him," Kimmel said, "and I think it feels premature." He went on to describe Colbert's response in his own words, explaining that stepping behind Kimmel's desk so soon after losing his own show simply felt like too much too fast. Not a rejection of Kimmel or the gesture itself, just bad timing for where Colbert was emotionally and professionally in that moment. Kimmel made clear the door was staying wide open regardless. "Anytime you want to host," he told Colbert. "It doesn't matter if it's the summer, I'll gladly step aside." It wasn't a one-time invitation with an expiration date attached. It was a standing offer from one host to another, no pressure included. And in the meantime, Colbert wasn't exactly sitting idle waiting for his next television gig. He'd already thrown himself into a passion project completely outside the late-night world, serving as an executive producer on The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, tapping into a lifelong love of Tolkien that long predated his television career. For a guy who just watched his nightly platform disappear, diving into something creative and entirely unrelated to the industry that had just let him go seems to have offered exactly the kind of reset he needed, a project driven by genuine interest rather than a scramble to stay in the spotlight. There's also a practical detail worth noting. Kimmel's summer numbers were strong on their own. He told Variety that June had actually been his best ever month for average nightly viewers, crediting some of that boost to the attention swirling around Colbert's cancellation and the broader late-night shakeup. In other words, Kimmel didn't need Colbert to save his ratings. The invitation was a genuine gesture of solidarity between two hosts, not a business necessity. While all of this was unfolding, Kimmel was dealing with a crisis of his own that gave him a very personal understanding of what Colbert was going through. In September 2025, ABC abruptly pulled Jimmy Kimmel Live off the air after a monologue in which Kimmel discussed the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Contrary to a lot of the early headlines, Kimmel hadn't joked about Kirk's death or made light of the killing. His actual target was what he described as an effort by some figures within the MAGA movement to distance the shooter from their own political camp, mischaracterizing him as anything but one of their own. Still, the remarks set off an immediate political firestorm. Conservative commentators, elected officials, and major ABC affiliate groups, including Nexstar and Sinclair, accused Kimmel of being insensitive to the moment, and the pressure built quickly enough that ABC suspended the show indefinitely while it sorted out how to respond. The suspension became a genuine national story almost overnight. Supporters argued Kimmel had been criticizing the political spin around the murder, not the murder itself, while critics said the timing was simply inappropriate no matter the intent behind it. More than 400 actors, writers, comedians, and producers signed an ACLU-backed open letter condemning the suspension as a threat to free expression, and notably, a number of conservatives who disagreed with Kimmel politically still spoke up for his right to say what he thought without losing his job over it. President Trump, for his part, welcomed the suspension publicly, while FCC Chairman Brendan Carr criticized Kimmel's comments too, though Carr later pushed back on the idea that federal officials had leaned on the network to pull the show. 6 days later, ABC reversed course, announcing that after what called thoughtful conversations with Kimmel, the show would return to the air. The network said the original suspension had been meant to avoid further inflaming a tense situation at an emotional moment for our country. When Kimmel came back, he addressed it directly and emotionally, telling his audience it was never his intention to make light of Kirk's death, that he didn't see anything funny about it, and that he'd meant every word of the condolence message he'd posted right after the shooting. He clarified that his frustration had been with people using the tragedy for political advantage, not with Kirk himself, and he thanked the people across the political spectrum, including those who disagreed with him, who defended his right to speak. Seen side by side, Colbert's cancellation and Kimmel's suspension told a similar story from 2 different angles. Both men had spent years as 2 of the most consistent, sharpest critics of Donald Trump on network television. Both had drawn repeated public attacks from Trump directly, who called Kimmel terrible and untalented over the years and predicted, incorrectly, that Colbert's ratings would eventually collapse under the weight of his political material. Instead, both hosts built loyal, resilient audiences that stuck with them through years of controversy. And by the fall of 2025, both had found themselves at the center of major disputes involving their own networks, disputes that raised uncomfortable questions about how much room outspoken hosts actually have left in an industry under mounting financial and political pressure. That shared experience is really what made Kimmel's guest host invitation feel less like a career opportunity and more like one friend checking in on another. And it's likely part of why, months later, the 2 of them did something unprecedented. On September 30th, 2025, Kimmel and Colbert appeared as guests on each other's shows on the very same night, Kimmel sitting down with Colbert at the Ed Sullivan Theater, while Colbert simultaneously appeared on Kimmel's stage. Kimmel opened his broadcast joking that it was something unprecedented, done partly in his words as a fun way to drive the president nuts. During their conversation, Colbert opened up in detail for the first time about the moment he learned his show was ending, describing how he found out from the 2 hosts' shared manager after a taping and admitting just how physically overwhelming the news had been in the moment. It was a strange kind of full-circle moment. The guest hosting offer Colbert once turned down as too soon eventually evolved into something arguably more meaningful. 2 rivals turned allies, publicly standing shoulder to shoulder on each other's stages at the same time, addressing the very controversies that had briefly reshaped both of their careers. As of this video, Colbert has not signed on with any streaming platform or rival network, and no formal return to nightly television has been announced. Rumors about a potential podcast or a new project continue to circulate, but nothing has been made official. For now, his focus appears to be squarely on work outside the traditional late-night format, his producing role on the Tolkien project chief among it. What his departure really underscores, though, is a much bigger story than one host's exit. Even a program that led its time slot for 9 straight years wasn't immune to an industry grappling with shrinking ad revenue, ballooning production costs, and audiences that have scattered across streaming, YouTube, podcast, and social platforms. CBS has never wavered from its position that the cancellation was a financial decision and nothing more. But given everything that happened in those few weeks, the lawsuit, the settlement, the monologue, the merger, the newsroom shakeup, it's easy to understand why so many people still aren't fully convinced that's the whole story. What is clear is this: when the industry around them seemed determined to make an example out of outspoken hosts, Colbert and Kimmel chose loyalty over competition. One turned down an offer because the timing wasn't right. The other kept the door open anyway. And eventually, they both ended up standing on each other's stages, making the exact kind of jokes that had gotten them both into trouble in the first place. Proof that, whatever changes with the business of television, some friendships in this industry are apparently built to last. Zoom out far enough, and the Colbert-Kimmel saga isn't really an isolated story about two friends and a scheduling favor. It's a snapshot of an entire television format trying to figure out whether it still has a future. Late night used to be one of the most stable institutions in American broadcasting, a nightly ritual with predictable ratings, predictable ad rates, and predictable career paths. That stability has been eroding for years, chipped away piece by streaming platforms that don't run ads the same way, podcasts that let comedians build political commentary shows without a network standing between them and their audience, and social media clips that let a single joke reach more people in a morning than the original broadcast reached the night before. Against that backdrop, corporate ownership starts to matter in a way it never quite did before. A network that's mid-merger, or trying to stay in the good graces of